welcome to In Touch. I'm Lucy Sondels. My guest today is David Rodich, the local historian. He's going to talk today about women's role in founding and creating Wadsworth, making it what it is today. David, did you have any problem? I know you've got a lot of stuff here. Did you have a problem finding all this information?
Well, one of the problems that we have in recording the role of women in history is because they were always someone's daughter or somebody's wife or somebody's mother. You'll find in going through the records that many of the early history books never list a woman by name. They always list her by her relationship to someone else. And in fact, even in the obituaries up until the 1930s, just shortly before the Second World War, you could go through an entire very lengthy obituary for a woman that would list all of her good deeds and activities, but it would never give her first name. She was always Mrs. John Smith, or the mother of Jim Jones, and they never gave specific names. Also in the old histories, the genealogies, we've referred before to the wonderful work done by the Reverend Edward Brown in 1874 in writing the Wadsworth Memorial. And in the back of that book is a genealogical section on the founding families of Wadsworth. And this is very accurate. It still is an important reference source for us today. But quite often he'll say that a family had 4 sons, and then they'll name them and what their occupations were, and then say, and 6 daughters.
Boom,
and
that's it, no name.
No information about them, unless they happen to be married to someone who was prominent.
Oh. Here I thought maybe a daughter would be easier to trace because it would be Miss, you know, Miss Elsie Smith, perhaps. But no.
I got myself into trouble a few years ago because now this is a copy of a invitation to a donation party. Of course, the ministers in the early days were not paid very well, and so it was necessary for the different congregations to have fundraising services towards the end of the year. And this is one for Reverend Orlando Badgley, who was pastor of the Methodist Church. And when I found this and I read through it, I thought that it was really very quaint and very interesting, because if you'll notice, it'll have Mrs. E.G. Loomis, again, no first name, Robert Stevenson and Lady, J.V. Hamilton and Lady, John A. Clark and Lady. And I thought that that sounded awfully quaint, and I pointed that out to a couple of women that I knew, and they just about hit me with it.
It's okay, only if your name is Lady.
Well, I guess so, but you couldn't, they were not acknowledged by their own name. This is a copy of the burial records for Woodlawn Cemetery here in Wadsworth. And if you look, just picking pages here, pick one that's easy to read. This is the burial list for 1903. And you see as you go down through the list, Mrs. Charles Anda, Mrs. Joseph Lytle, Mrs. O.V. Dibble, and again, even in their burial records, and oftentimes on the death certificates, if you do genealogical research, it gets a little maddening at times because you don't have that type of reference. But the women certainly were here from the very beginning of Wadsworth. And in fact, when the Deans and the Durhams arrived in 1814, Mrs. Dean and Mrs. Durham saw no other women but one another for over 6 months. And it was during that time that Mrs. Durham, in July of 1814, gave birth to the first child born in Wadsworth. So if you can imagine them coming across the mountains, through the wilderness, building a rude log cabin, and all this time with all the other troubles and difficulties that they had to experience, have the prospect of giving birth. And
well, I would imagine it'd be very lonely also.
It was, because there was no one else with whom they confide. And even they, of course, did not live next door to one another. It was a large trek through the woods. And our woods here were still populated with wild animals. There are many, many references that we'll perhaps talk about later on of housewives who were cleaning the cabin, and a snake come up through the rough floorboards. They'd have to beat the snake down and then go on about their work. And these, the women were remarkably resilient when you see some of the things that they had to endure during those times. Now, we were talking earlier about some of the, well,
start with these? Okay. Okay.
I had occasion to speak last year to a couple of classes at the junior high school, and one of the questions that they asked were there any famous people from Wadsworth? Well, I guess famous is a relative term, and certainly there were people who contributed it to one degree or another throughout our history. But one famous person who was born here, and about whom we've talked before, was Laura Celestia Spellman. Her father, Harvey Buell Spellman, came to Wadsworth as a storekeeper in the 1830s and lived in this house right here on Main Street. As a point of reference, this is the American Legion building to the north of it. Of course, Main Street and the Oddfellows building across. And he had a little store in the front. And they were only here a short while, but it was while they were here that this daughter was born. Now, if that name isn't immediately familiar to you, you might know that later she met a young man in Cleveland and married him, and his name was John D. Rockefeller.
Oh.
So little Laura Celestia Spellman, who was born on Main Street in Wadsworth, grew up to marry the richest man in the world. And she was responsible in her own right for a lot of good works and benevolences. Of course, Spellman College, which was donated in her memory, and did a lot on her own.
Okay.
Women have always been active in the patriotic organizations, even though they didn't serve in the military in those days. They supported the men when they went off and did many things to commemorate their good deeds. This is a picture of the dedication of the Revolutionary War Monument in our Woodlawn Cemetery by the Akron area chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. This looks like something that may have been taken in a convent, but in fact, this is Mrs. Dr. Wise and Mrs. William Alt at the turn of the century, at First World War, and they were volunteers who rolled bandages and did other type of what we would, I guess, call it Red Cross activities. But even we were talking privately a little bit ago about the clothing that the women wore in those days, because not only did they have to cook and clean and raise the children and help out in the fields and all of these other things, but social pressure or social custom dictated what they were to wear also. And even these dresses that they have on for doing volunteer work, and you look at the scissors and the keys around their necks tied with that rope, it doesn't look in the least bit comfortable, and they're wearing gloves also. So it doesn't look like the ideal outfit that you'd want to wear to do that type of work.
The top appears to be all white, probably starched. That's all done by hand.
I would think so, very stiff. It doesn't, to a large degree, resemble a nun's habit, the old style, but even the nuns have given those up.
Yeah, it almost looks like one of those nurses' outfits.
This is a picture that we've looked at once before. This is in front of the old Lutheran Church on High Street, where the present Lutheran Church is located. And these are the ladies of the Women's Relief Corps, which was the adjunct to the Grand Army of the Republic, the veterans of the Civil War, what you might call a forerunner of the VFW or the American Legion. And this was the Women's Auxiliary. And you can tell by the way they're dressed that evidently they've been having a social inside the rooms of the church. And they were very instrumental in Wadsworth life until probably about the 1920s or 30s, where they were a power to be reckoned with. They did a great deal of good. As I said, they raised money through their benefit dinners. They decorated the graves of the soldiers. There's a monument in the center of the cemetery, an obelisk where we normally celebrate Memorial Day, that they had donated, and also they provided for the indigent of town also. So they're a very active organization. And of course, they were also very active in their church work. And this happens to be the Women's Missionary Society of the Trinity Reformed Church. But again, if you look at the clothing that they had to wear, in most of this, they didn't have modern washing machines, of course, not even the old wringer washers. It was all done by scrub board or copper boilers. And a tremendous amount of work to keep those clean and to do that besides everything else that was necessary for them to do.
That's right. I'm glad I wasn't born then.
But even in those early days, in the 1880s and 1890s, women did work outside of the home. And these are three of women who were the first telephone operators in Wadsworth, standing outside of Telephone Central, which is located down approximately where the drive-through for Bank One on College Street is.
Oh, okay.
Now, it's rather interesting to me because in the early days, in factories, some people have in recent years denigrated secretaries, that is not considered a lofty job. A woman ought to have a real job. And anyone who's had to depend on a secretary knows that the tremendous job they do. In fact, in my past business dealings, I had to deal with certain business executives, and had it not been for their secretaries, I don't think they would have known the time of day. If they got too far away from their office, and frequently the secretaries would even call from home to remind them about things and make sure that they were doing what they were supposed to do. But my point is that in those days, secretaries as they existed were generally male. And it was not until really about the First World War that you started seeing female secretaries or stenographers in the office. But they did allow women to work in the factory, to do the heavy work. And this is a picture from about 1905 of the interior of the Wadsworth Salt Company down on State Street. And these women are hand packing the boxes of salt, the saltiest salt in the world. I noticed they did get a man there, the wheelbarrow, but...
yeah, he looks quite young. Doesn't look quite like a man to me. Looks like maybe
well, most of these were young girls who, by the time they got through what we would say 6th or 7th grade, 8th grade perhaps, they were considered to have sufficient education. And it was oftentimes necessary for them to move into town from the farm because they had large families, and they would have to find some means of supporting themselves. The reason I've included this picture, the event is the driving of the Gold Spike to complete the streetcar line in 1907. But the reason I've included the picture is to indicate, you see the woman walking across here with the long dresses and the there, but the condition of the roads at that time, and this was probably a good day.
Yeah. Keeping their shoes clean, obviously, was a...
And again, being active during the First World War. This is one of the Red Cross booths. You can see the lady has a red cross on top of her cap. But this is a cartoon or a caricature booth where you could have a cartoon drawn of yourself to raise money for the Red Cross effort. The Red Cross became active in Wadsworth about 1917, and local ladies were very much involved in it. Now, this picture is again included primarily because of the dress or the apparel. This is Edith Simister Sutton, who came from a very prominent Wadsworth family, the Simisters, and she was a graduate of the class of 1904, and she settled down to become a housewife, and she was very active in church activities and civic activities like that, but she did not work outside the home. However, her sister did, and became a missionary to China, and worked over there for many years until a family illness caused her to return briefly to the United States. And after her mother died, she returned again to China and then became ill herself. But it was through her efforts, the letters that she sent back, and the visits that she would make back here talking to groups and so forth, that caused a lot of relief aid to go to China. And in fact, they were members of the Methodist Church, and the Methodist Church had a Mary Simister Missionary Society and raised money to build churches over in China. Now, in the early years, when women were almost from the beginning teachers. In fact, one of the very earliest teachers in Wadsworth was brought from Talmadge at the age of 20. A man was sent on horseback 21 miles to fetch her and bring her back to Wadsworth. And even though she was only 20, she was an experienced teacher because she had begun teaching at the age of 15. And her term was 3 months, and she was paid $18 plus her room and board. She boarded at Captain Lyman. But at that time, this was about 1820, they couldn't come up with $18 in the whole city of Wadsworth. I know it's hard to imagine in a town like Wadsworth that you couldn't come up with money for schools, but in any case, they had to pay her in corn. And they took this to Middlebury, which would now be East Akron, and this was distilled into whiskey and was put into a large barrel, which it was just enough to make one barrel. And this was stored in her father's barn. And about 2 or 3 years later, they went to sell this whiskey, and they found out that half the barrel was gone. And they couldn't figure out what the reason had been until they discovered that one of their hired hands who had been acting strangely, had discovered the secret cache. And
so even her payment wasn't for her.
Wasn't in full. But it was really until this century, a woman, once she married, would have to resign from teaching. The teachers were all single women. In this picture here that we've seen before, we see Carolyn Treffinger, who was the principal of Franklin School in Wadsworth, and was also an authoress of some great note, and in fact had published some books which had won awards for her. Her most famous book is one called Ragdoll Jane, but these are two other books, Jimmy's Shoes and Lil Lon, Lad of Courage, for which she won. This is the award that she won there from the Boys Club of America for those books. But she never married. Now, the other woman in the picture with her is Lottie Mills, who was for over 50 years a Wadsworth teacher, and she was principal of the Lincoln School. And when she began teaching, her first job was teaching the second grade down at the old Union School where the Central Junior High is now. And her second grade class consisted of 75 students, though in later years her average classes were around 40, but she also never married. Women continued to be involved in the growth of Wadsworth after we established a hospital through the generosity of the Ohio Match Company. The nurses and directors of the hospital were succeedingly women, and this woman in the middle, Maud McCulley Hart, who is the daughter of a Methodist minister, and in fact was one of the telephone operators that we saw earlier in the picture, was very active in the different women's organizations in town and was instrumental in twisting the arm of some of our organizations to donate material and items for the hospital. Back at that time, the hospital, incidentally, they didn't go out and buy food from a central warehouse or something. They, the nurses and the workers at the hospital canned all their own food. And it was through almost all of those years that that had to be done. She happens to be with the Lions Club there, but if we can just take a moment.
Grab something.
That one, please. One woman who was particularly renowned in the 1800s is this woman right here, Anna Pardee King. She was the daughter of Judge Allen Pardee. It's one of those strange stories. She and her husband, Mr. King, had one child whose name was DeLoss King, who made quite a name for himself as an actor in New York and different areas around the country, but died at a rather young age. Her husband, the only accounts given say that her husband went to California and later died there. So you don't know exactly what was behind all that. But she suffered these losses early in her life and devoted herself to her church work, the Disciple Church, her First Christian, and also to the care of her aged father. And she's seen here on the porch of her home with two other cousins. Now,
can I ask why you have this ghost here?
Well, today we're trying to focus on women. And unfortunately, no matter how hard you try, you can't seem to get rid of us. And that's Aaron Pardee, who was Mrs. King's uncle, and of course the first mayor of Wadsworth. And you may think that he was the only man in the picture, but actually this child in the center is Mark Davis, who was a boy. But you can tell the way they dressed boys at that time with the curls and the long dresses and all that. It looks like a little girl. Something that I don't know if we can see on camera or not, but up at the top of the picture, you can just make out a sign above the door, and that says Ohio Farmers. I have one of those here.
That close up looks like this.
Like that. And the purpose of these was for identifications or for marking houses as to what company you were insured with. Of course, here in Wadsworth, where we have excellent municipal fire protection, if heaven forbid something happens to your business or home, the fire department responds. But in those days, and in fact in some places in this country it continues to this day, in order to receive fire protection, you paid to a particular company, and that company would have their own fire brigade, and if your house caught fire, they were notified and came. Of course, if the rival company showed up, they might just let your house burn. And as bizarre as that may seem, just in recent years, within the last 2 or 3 years, I've heard news stories where this has happened, where a fire company will show up, and because the premiums had not been paid, or because they are a rival fire company, they will not put out the fire.
Which is the way it worked back then.
Exactly.
And this is fire marks?
Exactly, to show so that they knew immediately that you were current. I guess if you didn't pay the premium, they came and took it off your house. Mrs. King is important for another reason also, because because of her activities in Wadsworth, and because of the respect which the community felt for her, she is one of only 2 people women who have streets named for them in Wadsworth, and of course King Street, right in downtown Wadsworth. Could we go to these, please? We were talking about some of the clothes, and I just wanted to send those through just as an example of the type of clothing. You can see this is taken in the captain's studio, Captain Woolbaugh's studio. I am certain that the women did not bring the guns with them. These are parts of his artifact collection, his curios and archaeological and military artifacts.
Was it common for women to know how to shoot guns back then, do you know?
In the early years, yes, it would have been. I would think around the turn of the century, by that time, they tended to be more genteel, unless they lived on a farm. Then in that case they may have to, because we do have reports I mentioned earlier about the housewives who had to beat off snakes. There were also reports where they would have to run in and get a gun and come out and shoot a bear that happened to be passing through the yard before going back to their work. Because the women at that time worked right alongside with the men in the field, particularly in the early days. They didn't just sit in the cabin. They actually had to go out and help. And you've probably even seen in some old movies where they would hitch the women up to the plow, or vice versa, and go through when they did not have animals available. So those are really very realistic. This is that Mary Overholt?
Yes.
It's Mary Overholt, and I just...
She's very pretty.
Yes, and I enjoyed seeing the lengths that they went to as far as the clothing is concerned.
Would that be a widow's outfit? Well, I guess not, because she's not really all in black. But
no, I guess it was just a style of the time. Now, this woman is Bertha Curtis, who was a member of a prominent Wadsworth family, and she is an exception to the rule, that proves the rule, I guess, because she married Charlie Holben, who was a mayor of Wadsworth, and also was involved with the Wadsworth Lumber Company. But she was a teacher for many years. And when Wadsworth had our normal college, we should mention that when the Mennonite College opened in 1867, it was strictly male enrollment. But because things didn't go too well for the college, they decided that they had to allow classes to be taught in English, and also they had to admit women. And the first year that they did that, in 1876, 4 women were enrolled. Now, the Mennonite College was not terribly successful, and that's why it eventually closed. But after the normal school opened, and for people who are not familiar with that term, normal school means one that trains people to be teachers. For instance, Kent State used to be called Kent Normal School. In any case, she continued there as a teacher for many years, and was very active again in the church and other activities. But she's an exception where she continued to teach even after her marriage.
Oh, I see. Well, this is a great dress.
Is that Edna Kastenheiser?
No, Edna Williams? Yes, Kastenheiser Williams. I'm reading the backs of these. David does it from memory.
But just again, the work and the hats. I meant to bring another picture that we've shown before of a group of women in the captain's studio where the hats are enormous. How they could even walk through a house with those.
Well, that kept their complexion pale so they wouldn't get suntanned like we do today and pay for it and wrinkled.
And so many of them with the cinched waist and the high collars.
There's also a studio portrait, looks like, too.
I can't imagine that there were too many people that Captain Woolbaugh did not photograph. Deladrere, I just think that's great. She looks like she's ready
This
to
is
go
wonderful.
on stage or something.
Wow. Is that a fan or is that feathers in her hand? I can't see from here.
Well, by her shoulder she has a rolled up paper, and here I think that's a feather fan.
Oh, combination. Oh my. That's great.
And this is three members of the class of 1903. On the left is Clara Engers Everhard and Edith Kintz Bixler and Nellie Harder. Of course, did not marry, and this is a graduation type picture that they had taken. Now, the two other ladies did marry, but Nellie did not, and after completing her year of school, she decided to become a teacher, because that's what a young woman did, as we said. And so she taught 1 year at what was called the Stony Ridge School, which still stands. It's now a residence on Reimer Road, west of 94. This is a little souvenir that she gave out to her students to commemorate the end of the school year. But she decided that teaching was not for her.
Oh, really? Well,
and
she cared so much to even do this for them, though.
Well, I guess it was just not sufficiently disciplined. So she taught the 1 year from 1903 to 1904, and then she went back to the newspaper where she had worked during some of her summer vacations. And in time, she purchased a part of the newspaper, and upon Mr. Hostetler's death in 1929, she became the editor and publisher of the paper, and then a couple of years later bought out his heirs. And the next picture we have is interesting because if you would look at it from a chauvinistic viewpoint, you would say, well, the two women in the picture must have been the secretaries, and of course that is Miss Harder, who we just saw, and she was the boss. In fact, they all called her affectionately the boss.
Did they really?
And the gentleman next to her is A.J. Michael, who was the associate editor of the paper. He came here in 1929 and remained until the paper was sold in 1944. But Mr. Michael is still living. He's probably around 90, and even to this day, when he speaks to me or writes to me, he always refers to her as Miss Harder, never calls her by her first name, which is Nellie, by the way. But that's the staff of the paper in 1939. Now, we've talked before about the wonderful things she did during the Second World War as far as seeing that all of the servicemen who had any connection whatsoever with Wadsworth received the Banner Press, and the fact that she was responsible for the servicemen being granted the franking privilege through her editorials that were picked up by Walter Winchell and eventually enacted by Congress. But she was also instrumental when the bank closed. When the Wadsworth Savings and Trust closed in 1930, the life savings of many, many people, what little they had at the outset of the Depression, as well as many churches and organizations, were sealed as if in a tomb. And it was through her untiring efforts that they were able to reorganize the failed Wadsworth Savings and Trust as the Citizens Bank and Trust Company, and she was the first woman in Wadsworth to serve on a bank board. Following her sale of the paper in 1944 to Jerry Hall, she wasn't one to sit idle and became the executive secretary of the Wadsworth Red Cross chapter, and so continued to help those servicemen and their families as they returned home and became reacclimated into civilian society. In her later years, she went to work for the Rittman Press and for a time in Barberton, but even in retirement up until shortly before her death at the age of 90, she continued to write a newspaper column, her reflections on the day's events for the local paper, and those provide still a valuable reference source.
What a remarkable woman.
Another woman who contributed to Wadsworth was Ella Everhard. This is the paper from 1942. I thought rather than just a picture, I'd bring this to be a little bit different. She was born Ella Finley, the daughter of a state senator, and she married Dr. Nathan S. Everhard, and with him worked for many years as they struggled through his medical practice and also through the development of the Ohio Companies. Dr. Everhard was a cousin of E.J. Young, the founder of the Ohio Companies, and E.J. Young had these wonderful ideas for the improvements on the injector and the patents for the matchmaking machines and the other activities, but he didn't have any money. And he borrowed what he could from relatives and so forth to get started. And he went to Dr. Everhard, his cousin, and talked him into loaning him, I believe it was $1,000. And when Mrs. Everhard found out about this, she was not happy. And she told Dr. Everhard, what do you mean giving that money? We can't afford to spare it. And of all the people in the world to give it to, you're going to give it to that harebrained cousin of yours. We'll lose it for sure. Says, you go and get it back. And he said, well, I can't do that, because I've given my word to him, and he's already got the money. So she went and tried to convince E.J. to return the money. But he somehow was able to persuade her to let them use the money. And, of course, the Everhards became millionaires many times over as a result of it. Dr. Everhard died in 1919, but she continued, as you can see from the paper, to live until 1942, and at a very advanced age. I think it was about 95. Every winter she would go to Florida for the climate, and when she was at a very advanced age, she made her first flight down there in a plane, and was very excited by all of that, and continued to maintain her home on Main Street here until her death. Besides, she and Dr. Everhard contributed greatly to the cost of building the present Lutheran Church. Obviously, all the members participated, but it's primarily because of the Everhards and the Youngs that the present beautiful Gothic, French Gothic church was built. Following the doctor's death, she continued in these benevolences, giving the building that originally housed the Salvation Army on Main Street, and also the Girl Scout Lodge at Camp Craig, and there were many different things in which they were involved.
Most notably, wouldn't it, at least for me, would be the library.
I was going to. That's our next picture. Backing up just a minute, it was in 1824 that Judge Frederick Brown, who was the first settler in the center of Wadsworth, went back to his Connecticut home and canvassed his neighbors and got donations of books, and brought a big box load of them by wagon across the mountains back to Ohio. And these books were put in charge of what was called the Wadsworth Female Library Association.
I'm not going to ask why, but that's all right.
And this was the first lending library to exist in Wadsworth. And through the succeeding decades, other attempts would be made, usually always under the auspices of the different women's organizations, particularly the FPA. But it was not until the 1920s that the need for a permanent place had become increasingly evident because of the growing population of Wadsworth. We talked once before about a row of buildings that once obscured the central school from view on Main Street, and one of these was a milliner's shop, and operated by Mrs. Plum, and Mrs. Plum also had charge of the books. And these were later moved to the, at that time Wadsworth did not have a city hall. Ours had been condemned, and it was not replaced until '36. So the mayor's office was up above what we would call the Brenneman building, or up above Picket Fence Floral. And Mayor Falk generously turned his office over to the women to house their growing library collection. And it was around this time that Charles Knight, the editor of the Beacon Journal paper, Knight Ridder News, was called upon to speak in Wadsworth. And at that time, he had a conversation with Marguerite Kramer Straighton, who was very much interested in developing a library for the community, and said, well, could you give me, I'd like to make a donation towards this cause. And says, could you recommend some books that you would like? So she came up with a rather sizable list, several pages, expecting that he would choose from this and send them. Well, he sent an amount sufficient to cover the entire cost of all the books. And so Mrs. Everhard was, through the efforts of Schuyler Durling, the Executive Vice President of the Wadsworth Savings and Trust, she was persuaded to buy this house as the first permanent home for the library. Some people have mistakenly referred to it as the Everhard House, since it housed the Everhard Library. but it was built in 1893 by Dr. Thomas Leiter, and he died prematurely in 1910, and his wife moved to Biloxi, Mississippi. So there were other owners of the house, and at the time that Mrs. Everhard purchased it, it was owned by the Mensch family. And she purchased it and donated it to the city to house that collection.
Yeah.
But their home had been on Main Street, 3 doors down from where Country Expressions is now, where the high rise is.
It's a grand house.
Now, we've talked about so many of the conventional ways in which women have participated in the church work and volunteer work and patriotic organizations, but not all of the women were that conventional, thankfully. And this is a picture of the Wadsworth Motorcycle Club.
No.
And I don't know that you can tell on camera or not, but there are several women in the sidecars, the different motorcycles. That's taken on the Broad Street, of course, across from Broad Street Park. But they were actively involved in the motorcycle club at that time. Just as an aside, I might mention this is Hood's. Well, at this time it's Durling's Motorcycle Shop. It was later Hood's. People might remember it as the Crook and Jackson Park Barber Shop and the Wadsworth Bakery, though at that time it was the Macedonian Bakery. Another example of the influx of foreign people to Wadsworth. But I was going to point out the sign on the side advertising a Charlie Chaplin movie.
Oh my, what a great photo. I don't know where you get these.
Now, you may think this is a beauty pageant, but it is not. This is a a patriotic festival that was held to further the idea of patriotism and love of country, and a very dramatic pageant was put on in this regard. And the woman in the middle is Mrs. Dr. McRitchie, and on the left is Pauline Shank, and on the right is Ruth Weinsheimer, who were acting as her attendants there. That's another thing I might mention, too, while we're talking about it. When I was saying earlier about women not being identified by their given names in those days, it was, and I'm told it comes from a German custom, but if your husband was a doctor, you were Mrs. Doctor.
Oh.
Or if your husband was a minister, Mrs. Reverend.
Oh.
Or a professor, you'd be Mrs. Professor. One explanation that was given to me for this is, first of all, the distinction of being married to a man of some education, right? But also because a lot of these families were very large, the Pennsylvania Dutch community, the German community, and they had a lot of people with the same names.
Yeah.
And so it was one way of differentiating one from another. But even through old writings, you'll see that they were always referred to as Mrs. Doctor. And in fact, well, I think we'll see that in a later picture. I'll bring that up. Now, Wadsworth has always loved music, and we've had bands probably long before the Civil War. In fact, there's some indication that we had a town band as early as the 1840s. But the one that is long remembered in Wadsworth is actually from the 1880s. And during all that time, they did not admit women. It was not until 1939 that the first women were admitted to the band. And in this picture, we have Hattie Neff Hartzell and Lillian Swaggart Seiberling, who was 4 years later to be elected the first president of the Wadsworth Band. And there's another woman in the picture, but there's a shadow on her face and I can't identify her. But this was taken down at the, I believe, down at the stadium, probably around 1939. But as I say, they were not permitted to participate. Now it's interesting because when Bert Franks brought music to Wadsworth schools in 1907, he formed an orchestra and he formed a band. Now women were permitted to be in the orchestra, but there were no women in the band. I have no reason for that whatever. Now this is interesting to me. You see that she has an apron on over her dress and all this, and you think, well, maybe she's just stepped out from baking cookies. But this is Mrs. Robert Birkbeck, who actually lived north of Wadsworth. And she decided that she was too cramped in her house, and her husband was very, very busy, and so she decided she was going to build her own house.
So she
built her house.
started, I mean, she actually completed it? And this
Yes.
is just right in the middle, huh?
There's another picture there showing some of the things that are...
Oh, yeah.
You see
She looks like she could handle the bricks, no problem.
the concrete blocks piled out front. And
Oh, that's her?
yes, she's up there working in her pith helmet. And
her skirt.
well, she in her dress, and she would put a kitchen apron over top of her dress,
her overalls
and then
something.
put carpenter's type apron that should have tools or nails in over top of that, and her pith helmet, and she'd get out there and work. And now her husband had to help her with some certain parts of it, and they did call in a couple of outside contractors for the roofing and some of that. But she was there from beginning to end. She was no slouch about it, and would work from early in the morning to late at night, and still kept the house clean and cooked the meals. And they lived on quite a large piece of property, so there was a lot of work to do outside also.
You know, just recounting this incident kind of puts in perspective the superwoman role that we talk about nowadays. You know, when a woman puts in work 9 to 5 and then goes home to a family. Well, this is a never-ending story.
Exactly.
And it hasn't begun with our generation.
Now, even though some of these are a little bit unusual, this is the women did not abandon their conventional or more traditional interests. And this woman in the center is Lydia Broadsword, who was a much venerated woman of the Disciple Church. She was one of those dear little old ladies, and she's in her 90s as this picture was taken, and she's there with her great-great-grandson. It's over there. It's a 5-generation picture. And the paper in Wadsworth was always big about playing these things up. Now, Mrs. Birkbeck's picture with the house was on the front page to show that this was interesting and novel. But be just as likely to have something like this on the front page, or people celebrating their golden wedding anniversaries. Now I've watched TV shows where people say that they've been married 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, and the audience breaks out in wild applause.
Ooh, so something about our society, huh?
This is a birthday party, a 90th birthday party for Emma Wassell. There's the little lady back here. And she was the mother of Mrs. Paul Bonnell, who was seated next to her. And this is just a group of the women that had gotten together. This is Adelaide Fale and Rilla Crable. I'm trying not to use husbands' names. Let's see, Mrs. Irwin's in the picture, Mrs. J.B. Irwin, and Mrs. Worthington and Mrs. Long. But they were celebrating her birthday party there.
Was this perhaps in the paper also?
Yes. Yes. And the women continued with their work. This is Jeremy Brittlinger, and she was the Victory Queen at the time that was taken, and was surrounded there by her court.
Is this a yearly event, or?
No, this was a special thing because of World War II, taken during the Second World War.
And there's other women in the picture, too. Searching for something that's not there?
Yes, as usual.
You'll find it soon enough, I'm sure.
As I mentioned, the women were very supportive of the war efforts, not just content to sit at home, but to keep active. This is a little different angle on that. This is the Defense Mothers in July 1941. This is a group of women whose sons were in the military already, and who organized to offer them support and encouragement, and also to try to prevent us from going to war. They were very active in contacting the congressmen and senators and lobbying to see that we did not go to war. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. And many of those same women became the Blue Star Mothers. Well, actually, they were the Blue Star Mothers that we talked about on one Memorial Day show, where you would hang a blue star in your window to signify that you had a man or a woman in the service, and then if the person was killed in action, then they changed to gold stars. We're not real sure about this. Someone said that it was a sewing group, and someone else believes it's cirrhosis. which of course is still a very active organization in Wadsworth. The first group of that type, aside from the Female Library Association, to organize was in 1896, the FPA, the Followers of Pallas Athene, which of course is still very active here in Wadsworth. And that, along with Cirrhosis and Parmenu and the Wadsworth Garden Club and Art and History and Literature and Arts, I get them all in there.
Don't want to miss any here.
We're all very active in the community and continue to be.
They were all organized for different reasons, obviously.
Yes, different types of pursuits, though it wasn't unusual for a woman to belong to more than one of them. And in fact, it was at the time that they joined together as the Federation of Women's Clubs, though each one has their own separate organization.
Was that to kind of organize the types of activities they did?
I think that was probably an idea to try and so that they were not spread too thin and that they would be able to take advantage of the larger group, right. This is a picture of the Wadsworth Police Department, and we've looked at this picture once before, but the women in the back were the dispatchers for the police department. Of Emma Jean Cassidy and Nellie Leatherman and Miss Dakin, and I can't recall the other woman's name quickly.
I'm just amazed you can recall as many names as you can.
Some organizations weren't as identifiable as the Cirrhosis or the FPA. Previously, we had talked about Mayor Fred Falk, who had a habit of organizing women into groups for some purpose. And
not quite being able to determine this from the photograph.
Exactly. They're not all readily apparent.
Well, they look like some sort of marching group.
It's some type of a flag corps.
Flag corps, yeah.
And he also, of course, he's in his military uniform over there. And he also had a group called the Milkmaids that we've taken a look at that picture once before, I believe. The women with their stools.
Yeah. And these appear to be rather young women, too, so maybe flag corps of some sort. Well, I've just got the message here that we're almost at the end of our time, so see, you'll be able to go home and discover all those goodies that you might have left at your house that
we'll
we can continue with.
We don't want to slight any of the women.
That's right. Well, see, I knew we'd have enough for more than one program. I told you these women were dynamic here in Wadsworth. But I know that you want to mention a couple other things before we...
There were a couple other things. We had talked when we were together last November about the First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, celebrating their anniversary, the 150th anniversary of their building, which I thought was a very interesting angle to take on that because, of course, the congregation is much older than that. But they were just focusing on their building and the role of the building in the congregation and the congregation in the community. And they had a very fine celebration a couple of weeks ago. Also, since we were last together, we've had two longtime businesses in Wadsworth that have undergone changes. And the first of these is John Gaiman, who for over 46 years had delivered eggs to the homes of Wadsworth. And in fact, my family's been getting things from he and his father. At one time they had poultry also for over 50 years. But he's decided to retire from the business. His son is going to other areas, so we wish him a lot of success in his retirement. And we were worried. We were faced with the prospect the first time in 50 years having to buy eggs in a store. But we found another supplier. Also, Carl Dudley, who for many years has owned the Stonier's Jewelry Store, has decided to retire. And we faced the prospect that maybe it would be closed entirely, but the business has been purchased by Gary and Isabel Hartman, who are Wadsworth residents, and they are going to continue to operate it under the Stonier name.
Picture here.
Bill Stonier he was a native of Wadsworth, but had moved away as a young man. They lived in a farm south of town, came back to Wadsworth, and bought the store from Clifford Moats in 1930. It was located at that time on High Street, and 2 years later he moved it to 137 College Street, where it's been located since. And besides his activities within the store. He was Mr. Stonier was very active in the Lions Club and also with his church activities, and had a particular interest for gardening, and was one of the sponsors for many years of the Garden Club show. And this is a picture taken inside the jewelry store, and you can see many of the bouquets and planters that are around there. And also, beginning in 1934, he was elected to the City of Wadsworth and continued in that capacity under 6 different mayors until his untimely death. But we wish Mr. and Mrs. Hartman, who will both be operating the store, a great deal of success, and we're glad to know that the hallmark name of Stonier will continue in this community. And as we say goodbye today, we can take a little look at a clip of some activities in that store about 1941.
Well, David, thank you for coming, and I'm glad we can continue this discussion next time. I want to hear more about these fabulous ladies from Wadsworth. And thank you for watching In Touch.